Dare to struggle.
Dare to win.
Dare to struggle.
Dare to win.
Dare to struggle.
Dare to win.
Now, why do we chant dare to struggle, dare to win?
Because we're a cult.
Well,
Because
perhaps, but we also want to win. That's part of it. And that's actually what this next section is about. We already did the basics, the kindergarten stuff, what we want, what we're against, and all of that. But this whole section is about how we can actually win. And a lot of people have pointed out that there's a lot of literature that talks about all of this that has a chapter 5 problem. Right? That they're very good at chapter 1, telling you what the problem is. Chapter 2, telling you how bad the problem is. Chapter 3, telling you how really bad the problem is. Chapter 4, telling you how even worse the problem is. And then chapter 5 ends with, be a liberal activist, maybe. Vote for Bernie. Yeah. And that this is really the crux of what we're getting at, right? And that's why we're saying dare to struggle, dare to win, right? But I actually want us to sing that song we sang at the beginning of the day again, right? Because that really kind of points to what we're getting at, right? So shall we sing that song one more time? Step by step, the longest march can be won, can be won. Many stones can form an arch, singly none, singly none. And by union, what we will can be accomplished still. Drops of water turn a mill, singly none, singly none. So we're hitting on something that's very important, because what Peter was talking about with fandoms is that fandoms are an individual thing. It's about you being an individual consumer, you being satisfied by the fandom producer, you then competing with other people to prove that you're the best fan. It's a very individual thing. But the whole way that we've ever won anything in this world has been not with an individualist mindset, but rather with a collective mindset, seeing our common interests and working together as a group. And that the ideology that defines the Western world, they talk about liberalism, which is an ideology that celebrates individualism above all else. And the right focuses on market liberalism, which is the idea that the state and society shouldn't control the economy. And the left focuses on personal and social liberalism, which is the idea you have no obligation to your country, your family, or your community. You can just pursue your own interest. You can just be yourself. And we are trying to cultivate collective consciousness, to get people to see what they have in common and how they can work together for a common aim. And so we are what they call, and they say is the greatest evil, we are an illiberal movement. We are rejecting liberalism in favor of illiberalism. So there we go. So speaking of that, who wants to hit this first quote? Because this is directly from the Communist Manifesto.
I got it. The collision between individual workmen and individual bourgeois take more and more the character of collisions between two classes. Thereupon, the workers begin to form combinations, trades unions, against the bourgeois. They club together in order to keep up the rate of wages. They found permanent associations in order to make provision beforehand for these occasional revolts. Here and there, the contest breaks out into riots. Now and then, the workers are victorious, but only for a time. The real fruit of their battles lies not in the immediate result, but in the ever-expanding union of the workers. Marx, 1848.
So he's saying that as the conditions of capitalism get worse, and as the wages go down, and as the economy becomes less and less stable, workers realize they need each other. They can't do it on their own. And, an individual workman might go up to his individual boss and say, if you don't give me a better wage, I'm coming back. And he'll say, all right, well, I'll hire somebody else. But if all the workers get together and they say, we're going to withhold our labor, right, they can force a better concession, right? And that's the formation of the labor movement. But combinations are not just the labor movement. The common translation of the Communist Manifesto says workers begin to form combinations. And then it usually says in parentheses afterwards, trade unions. But that I don't think is necessarily the case. Combinations can also be unemployment associations. Combinations can also be, places where people are taught skills. Combinations are people forced by economic conditions to come together and work in their own interest. And I think we're going to be seeing a lot more of that pretty soon. I've been talking about a concept called strategic equilibrium. And that in a revolutionary movement, right, you generally have three types of organizing, three periods that you can organize in. The first one, can I have a marker? The first type of revolutionary organizing, here, I'll do that, is called strategic defensive. And that's the period we're in right now. And in a period of strategic defensive, the conditions in society are at the point that it's very hard to have a revolutionary organization, that you're just struggling to hold the group together. Right? And that's strategic defensive. And we've been in strategic defensive in the United States since the 1950s, since McCarthyism, where it's very, very difficult to hold together a revolutionary organization. And periods of strategic defensive are very difficult because the conditions among the masses are not to the point that they would want to join our organization. Society is stable enough that people would not, be receptive to our message, and that there's not divisions that allow us to exist. And so as a result, we split, we divide, we don't see progress. You can go out and do exactly the right thing, but not get any results. You're in strategic defensive. But then conditions in society deteriorate a little bit further to the point that, number one, the conditions in society get worse to the point that people can't survive on their own. And because they can't survive on their own, they have to form combinations. The only way they're able to live is if they're relying on other people. Under those conditions, when things are getting worse, when people need to rely on each other, what also is happening? The ruling class begin fighting with each other because their system is in crisis. Ronald Reagan used to say, we're all friends after 6 o'clock, right? He said, we're all friends after 6 o'clock, Democrat, Republicans. They're not all friends after 6 o'clock today. We can see that. Look at January 6th. Look at what's happening in this election. They are not all friends after 6 o'clock. They're trying to put each other in jail. And we are rapidly approaching, I think in the next 5 years, a different period of organizing called strategic equilibrium. And strategic equilibrium is a period in which, because of the conditions in society and because of the divisions in the ruling class, a mass revolutionary organization can begin to function in society because there will be conditions among the masses where they'll be suffering enough, they need to be taken care of, they need to join some kind of organization. And because the ruling class will be fighting enough among themselves, they'll see organizations that would lead the working class, they will see them as useful and necessary in their divisions, and they'll allow them to exist. Now, strategic equilibrium, we haven't seen that in this country really since the 1930s. That's when we saw strategic equilibrium. There was possibly the opening of it a little bit in the 70s, but it didn't fully happen.
Was that the New Deal? Was that equilibrium?
Yeah, and we're going to talk about it. The late 1930s was the last time we saw strategic equilibrium. The Communist Party was a mass organization that had membership in every major city. There were members of Congress that were sympathizing with it, and they had mass influence because conditions were bad enough with the Great Depression, and the divisions among the ruling class were to the point that they could be such a thing. Now, strategic equilibrium can then lead to, ultimately, strategic offensive, a period in which, during strategic equilibrium, there's been enough of a mass movement that has been created that there's basically a polarizing question in society that the society cannot escape. It's which side are you on? And the revolutionary movement is on one side, and they are the bulk of the one side of that question. They are the biggest force on the one side of that question. And so as that question becomes resolved, they move in to take power because they're on one side of a question that divides society. And this is how revolutions tend to happen. They tend to go like this. Right now we're in strategic defensive. We could soon be in strategic equilibrium, and then, hypothetically speaking, strategic equilibrium could lead to a situation where such a big mass movement has formed and society is divided right down the middle over a key question that, as resolving that key question, we could move into strategic offensive and move into the creation of a socialist society. And this is the way to understand these questions. Now, yes?
What kind of key question has ever brought people into a successful revolution?
Okay, well, we'll jump into that right now. The Russian Revolution, what was the question? The question was World War I. Will we continue fighting in World War I or not? And the Bolsheviks, it had been strategic defensive. They had been an isolated small group, but the conditions in society got to the point that there was a big division over the question of will we continue fighting in World War I? And the Tsar was viewed as incompetent, and the Tsar was brought down in the February Revolution. He was toppled, but then there was still division. Do we continue the war, just not with the Tsar, or do we end it? And there was a big division in society, and the Bolsheviks had built up this mass organization that said we want to end World War I immediately. And then they, as the anti-war guys, the biggest mass movement in the biggest bloc that was against continuing World War I, they were able to take power. Most of the time we've seen revolutions, it's been over the question of fascism. It's been, the Nazis are invading the country, and the communists that already have a mass base among the population become the biggest anti-Nazi or anti-fascist fighting force, and they're able to take power. In China, it was Japan. On the Korean Peninsula, it was Japan, right? The society is divided. Are we for the Nazis? Are we against them? Are we for Japan or against them? Well, the communists are the biggest fighting force, and they ultimately do this. And if you look at, this is how these things tend to happen. But a big part of this is divisions in the ruling class, which is a really important point, because people, again, in this fandom mode, they want to be like, well, we're not aligned with any capitalist. We're for revolution. And that's complete silliness. And if you read this next quote from the Communist Manifesto, he talks about divisions in the ruling class being key in how revolutions come about. So who wants to read the next quote? Oh, go ahead, Ellie. All right.
The bourgeoisie finds itself involved in a constant battle. At first with the aristocracy, later on with those portions of the bourgeoisie itself, where interests have become antagonistic to the process of industry. At all time with the bourgeoisie in foreign country, in all these battles, it seems itself compelled to appeal to the proletariat, to ask for help, and thus to drag it into the political arena. The bourgeoisie itself, therefore, supplies the proletariat with its own elements of political and general education. In other words, it furnishes the proletariat with weapons for fighting the bourgeoisie. Finally, in times when the class struggle nears the decisive hour, the progress of dissolution going on within the ruling class, in fact, within the whole range of old society, assumes such a violent, glaring character that a small section of the ruling class cuts itself adrift and joins the revolutionary class, the class that holds the future in its hands. Just as, therefore, at an earlier period, a section of the nobility went over to the bourgeoisie, so now a portion of the bourgeoisie goes over to the proletariat.
So what happens? The crisis in society is intensifying, and the rich and powerful are fighting with each other, but they can't fight their own battles. They need to recruit working people to be their foot soldiers, which is happening right now, in case you haven't noticed, right? They're recruiting us to be their foot soldiers as they fight with each other. Black Lives Matter, Occupy Wall Street, the Tea Party, January 6th. You're right. I mean, there's many examples of, as the rich and powerful are fighting.
Versus Harris, is that?
Yeah, the factions in the ruling class are fighting with each other, so they need to build mass movements of working people to be involved in politics to fight the other capitalists on their behalf, right? And that is what happens in a crisis. Usually they don't want any kind of mass movement happening. Well, you know, when they're all friends after 6 o'clock, they would prefer that no mass movement happens. But when there's a crisis, one faction needs to have their own army to battle another faction that has their own army. And so they have to allow mass organizations to come into existence. But they all realize it's very dangerous, and it's a little bit of a game. But if you look at how this is played out in American history or in the history of different countries, I mean, we could talk about it. We talked about the Russian Revolution earlier. So let's talk about another example, which is the Bolivarian Revolution in Venezuela. In the 1990s, Venezuela's economy was devastated. 1990s. Yeah. 1990s, after the fall of the Soviet Union, Venezuela was forced to cut its public budget to get IMF development loans. And so they drastically, they would go back to the International Monetary Fund. They'd say, we'll give you another development loan, but you got to cut the public sector. So we'll lay off public workers, we'll lay off workers in our power plants and in our transportation. And then they'd go back the next year and they'd say, all right, we'll give you another loan, but you have to cut more and more. And this devastated the Venezuelan economy. And, they had the Caracazo, I believe in 1989, where the cost of public transportation went up very significantly, and the population of Caracas went out and rioted against the cost in public transportation. So what happened? There were a number of wealthy capitalists in Venezuela who were not benefiting from this. It was Wall Street and the American corporations that were devastating the Venezuelan economy. There's a lot of Venezuelan business owners and Venezuelan capitalists that weren't benefiting from this. So they got this guy in the military named Hugo Chavez to try and have a military coup to stop the cuts in public spending, to defend the Venezuelan economy. And he tried to have a military coup and he failed. He went to prison. Then he got out of prison and he ran for president on a popular platform. And there was a mass movement, and he said he was for neither capitalism or socialism, just whatever was good for Venezuela. And he got elected. And almost immediately after he got elected, they called him a dictator, and they were accusing him of being a communist. And because the communists had been so essential in his campaign, he appointed a member of the Communist Party to his cabinet. And then we know what happens. Then 9/11 happened, and he was against the U.S. invading Afghanistan. And he said 9/11 was awful, but it doesn't justify what the USA is doing in Afghanistan. And on top of that, he was saying no to the Western banks, Wall Street banks, et cetera. And so because of that, there was an attempted military coup against him. And so he was arrested, and the military tried to remove him. But then the rank and file soldiers rose up and rescued him and brought him back to office in 2002, and they defeated the coup. And after that, he came out and he said, all right, the only way that we can save Venezuela from the cuts that have been imposed on the country is we need to move toward 21st century socialism. And so he put the oil of Venezuela, which had been nominally nationalized, but was basically controlled by BP and Chevron and American Oil, he put it under actual state ownership. And then he started using the oil money to provide services and rebuild the infrastructure. And with that oil money, they started to transition Venezuela towards socialism. And it was an alliance between the national capitalists of Venezuela, who wanted a stronger economy, but realized they needed the working class to have their back. And as things proceeded in Venezuela, the national capitalists became less and less important, but this mass movement that they had created got stronger and stronger and stronger, and that's what led Venezuela to where it is today. And if you look at revolutions throughout history, this is how they tend to happen. And so we should talk about them in American history. I mean, obviously, we've never had a revolution here, but we've had mass movements. The 1930s, that was the last time we were in a period of strategic equilibrium. What was happening? So we had the Great Depression was happening in the United States. And the economy, 1929, the stock market crashed, and they kept expecting it would get better. They had a song that was on the radio called "The Happy Days Are Here Again." They would play on the radio, but the happy days didn't come. It didn't get better. And it just kept getting worse, and it just kept getting worse. And so a section of the ruling class picked this guy named Franklin Roosevelt, who was just a standard, regular politician in New York State. He was just, from one of the wealthiest families. I believe his cousin or nephew or one of his other relatives had been president before, Theodore Roosevelt. Distant cousin, yeah. And he was from one of the wealthiest families, and he took office, and he was backed by the Rockefeller oil companies, but he was also backed by the National Association of Manufacturers, and they brought him in, and he was going to make the economy better with the National Recovery Act. And the National Industrial Recovery Act was his plan to make the economy better. And they pushed it very, very hard, and it was largely degrowth. The first National Recovery Act was a degrowth plan. What did they do? They killed half the cows in the country. During 1932-33, he sent the Department of Agriculture out, and they killed half the cows in the country and buried them, and they poured lime on the bodies so no one could dig them up and eat the meat. And that was supposed to make the price of beef go up. And there was all kinds of degrowth measures that were just trying to make the U.S. economy better. But it didn't work. It didn't work. And the Communist Party at that time was aligned with the Soviet Union, and it was building these unemployment movements, demanding work or wages. They had huge hunger marches and rallies demanding, jobs and, worker wages now, don't starve, fight. They had this mass movement of hungry, unemployed people. So then the summer of 1934 happened. And the summer of 1934 is one of the most important summers in American history. Because what happened that year was in San Francisco, the dock workers went on strike led by a communist labor union. And they shut down the docks of San Francisco. And the truck drivers of Minneapolis went on strike, led by the Teamsters. And the auto light workers in Toledo, Ohio also went on strike. And all of these strikes were like national emergencies. The National Guard was sent in, and it was like, communists were controlling the city and things like that. All throughout the South, there were sharecropper strikes. South Carolina declared a state of emergency because the sharecroppers were on strike. And 1934, it was clear the country was in the state of uprising because these labor unions, workers on the job, and unemployed workers were rioting and protesting. So Roosevelt, as the president, and his National Industrial Recovery Act, which was pretty awful, wasn't making things better. So what do we find out? We find out that the National Association of Manufacturers, which is the factory owners, they said these protests, these unions are a big threat, because that could lead to communist revolution and they're going to force us to sign union contracts. So they began talking with the military about overthrowing Roosevelt and installing a fascist dictatorship. And it was called the Business Plot. And Smedley Butler of the U.S. Marine Corps blew the whistle and announced that they'd approached him about trying to overthrow the government and install a fascist dictatorship. Why did they want a fascist dictatorship? To crush the protests and the mass movements that were going on. So Roosevelt realizes, 1934, that there's unrest in the country and that if things don't get better, he's going to be killed. He's going to be overthrown and the military is going to topple him. So what does Roosevelt do? In 1935, he creates the Works Progress Administration. And over the head of Congress, with the stroke of a pen, executive order, he hires millions of unemployed people and he puts them to work. In 1935, you had the Works Progress Administration was created. Millions of unemployed people are hired. After that, you then had the Wagner Act, which legalized labor unions and made labor unions legal, 1935. So 1936, Roosevelt ran for president, once again, for re-election. And he's passed all these popular reforms, and the bulk of his own class wants him out. But during the 1936 election, he starts sounding very, very radical. And he starts talking about economic royalists, and he starts talking about war profiteers, and never before has Wall Street been so united in their hatred of a candidate, but I welcome their hatred. And he's inviting labor unions and communist folks to meet him at the White House and all of this. 1936, they have a presidential election. And in 1936, they announce the National Association of Manufacturers. Henry Ford says, if Roosevelt gets reelected, we're going to lay people off en masse because he taxes us too much and we're going to lay people off. Well, Roosevelt wins the 1936 election en masse because he's provided these services to hungry people. So after he gets reelected, the employers start making good on their promise. And they start saying, you know what, we're going to lay people off. And it starts in Akron, Ohio. Rubber workers are told they're laid off because Roosevelt has been reelected. So they don't leave their factory. And they sit down and they occupy their factory. And it's the sit-down strike. And then in other parts of the country, workers, they're going to lose their jobs. And they don't just protest outside the plant. They sit down and they occupy the plant. So all of this leads to then January, or like the end of the year, 1936, 1937, January, you have the Flint sit-down strike, where auto workers in Flint, Michigan, they are on strike and they occupy their factory. And workers from all over the country are driving to Flint, Michigan to support the auto workers that have occupied their factory. And thousands of workers gather, and the police try to drive them out of the plant. And there's the famous Battle of Bull's Run, where they take the fire hoses from inside the plant and knock over the police with the fire hoses. And then the military is sent to Flint, Michigan by Roosevelt, and everyone's expecting that the military is going to come and drive the workers out of the plant. But then everyone's blown away when the military pulls up to the plant and points the machine gun away from the factory and is protecting the workers' right to occupy their plant. And Roosevelt says that workers have the right to occupy their factories. And at that point, then the company surrenders, and that's how the United Auto Workers was created. That's why auto workers have the good wages they have, was because of that. But then at that point, the president of the United States is saying you have the right to occupy your factory. So all across the country in 1937, you had this sit-down strike wave of 1937, where workers began occupying their factories to demand, better conditions. And Roosevelt, the president of the United States, is saying that they have the right to do it. Right? This is a division in the ruling class. And it's because those factory owners are the ones trying to overthrow him, and the people who are backing him are the Rockefellers that are oil monopolies. They're not as threatened by the industrial unions. It's not as much of a threat to them. They're making money from oil. And so there's a division in the ruling class. And in 1937, you have a huge expansion of the Communist Party, and the CIO, the Congress of Industrial Organizations, emerges as this mass organization of workers occupying their factories, the CIO. And this is a moment where you can talk about strategic equilibrium. The Communist Party was a household name that people were following and supporting in mass, and it was leading the CIO, and it was because of this division in the ruling class. Go ahead, Rachel.
Nowadays, people, I think that back then that workers like had this right to strike or sit down, but it sounds like what you're saying is that conditions are kind of similar to they are now. Like it's illegal for my husband to form a union or to sit down and strike at Toyota, but if it were the same as back then, they just do it. And when enough people do it, then somebody in the ruling class says, okay, we got to let them do it. Is that kind of the idea? Like they're not asking permission to strike. They just.
Yeah, it was illegal to go on strike in a lot of states. It was illegal to have a union at all in a lot of states to go on strike.
See what I'm saying? Like a lot of people these days, they're like, oh, well, we don't have unions. Oh, we don't have this or that. But they didn't have them either, but they just did it.
Right, and it was a division in the ruling class that created this. Now,
Previous attempt ended in just, Pinkerton shooting people.
Right,
down,
yeah, so
right?
they tried before, but apparently there was enough of a momentum.
yeah, 1934 was not the biggest strike wave in American history. The biggest strike wave in American history was in 1877. It was the railroad workers. They went on strike, but they didn't win a single thing. There was way more of them.
And then Debs, was that?
And, yeah, Debs was the leader of it, and he went to prison, and when he got out, he became the socialist leader. But they didn't win a single thing in 1877. But why did they win so much in 1934? Why is it in response to the 1934 strike wave that you got the Wagner Act, you got all this division in the ruling class? Because they were aligned with 1/5 of the world. They were aligned with the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union was having an economic boom during these times while the Western world was having the Great Depression. And they were seeing these strikes they were carrying out were in alliance with a major global movement and one of the major countries in the world. And that's one thing that I really wish people could understand. And we'll talk about that later when we talk about the civil rights movement, right? That these, these global situations have a really big impact, right? And that Roosevelt and his popular reforms and the rise of fascism and all of that had a lot to do with the Soviet Union existing. Now, Roosevelt, was he a communist? No, he was not. And that then, he was in favor of an alliance with the Soviet Union against Nazi Germany, right? Nazi Germany arose, and Nazi Germany was a rival of the United States. It canceled debts to American and British banks, and Nazi Germany was doing a lot of things that American and British banks didn't like. But the United States government obviously didn't like the Soviet Union either. And so there was a division. Who should we be more friendly to, Nazi Germany or the Soviet Union? Well, the National Association of Manufacturers, they wanted to be friendly to Nazi Germany and focus on opposing the Soviet Union because they thought communism was the biggest threat. And Roosevelt and a lot of the British capitalists said we want to focus on Nazi Germany, and if we have to have an alliance with the Soviet Union to do that, we can do that. Now, the Soviet Union was constantly asking to form a global, anti-fascist bloc against Nazi Germany. And the Western countries were refusing because so many of the capitalists were tied in with Nazi Germany. And then Spain, right? The Spanish Republic, the king of Spain had stepped down. They had an elected government, and they had a communist majority in the parliament in Spain. And so Franco, the military leader of Spain, violently overthrew the Spanish Republic. You had the Spanish Civil War, and Spain's government was being overthrown, and the Nazis and the Italian fascists were sending weapons and military support to help Franco, and Franco eventually did overthrow the Spanish Republic. So when the Spanish Republic was overthrown and Spain became a fascist country as well, the Soviet Union said, wow, well, we've been trying to make an alliance with the Western capitalist countries all this time, but they don't want to make an alliance with us. And so they said, you know what, maybe we can make an alliance with Nazi Germany. So you had the 1939 Pact. Well, the U.S. government was obviously not thrilled about that. So Roosevelt reacted very negatively, and he actually put the leader of the Communist Party in prison, Earl Browder, and he sent Earl Browder to prison on a passport violation. The Roosevelt administration kind of went into an anti-communist frenzy after the pact was signed. But then when the Soviet Union was invaded by Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union was fighting Nazi Germany, and it became clear that, that the United States and the Soviet Union were allies, he let Earl Browder out of prison, and the communists became an essential part of the war effort. And right before he died, Roosevelt proposed an economic Bill of Rights, which is part of our 4-point plan. Why did he do that? because he was trying to mobilize the American people to fight the war, because the Soviet Union was one of their aligned countries, because the Communist Party and the labor unions were such a big part of his alliance, because so many of the wealthy capitalists had been doing business with the Nazis. Prescott Bush, had his accounts, seized. He'd been doing business with the Nazis. There were Henry Ford and some others. And so because the capitalists were seen as not particularly loyal, and because the labor unions and the Communist Party were essential in kind of mobilizing the country to fight in the Second World War, he started talking about an economic Bill of Rights. Now, this is all important because we can't view history in terms of good guys and bad guys. It's not a question of Roosevelt being a good guy or a bad guy. It's a question of he was at war with his own class. He was from a wealthy family, and the bulk of the capitalist class was against him. And so in order to maintain his power, he needed working class people to be on his side. Now, what eventually happened is Roosevelt died right as World War II was ending. We got a new president, Truman, and then we had the booming economy and McCarthyism. But I could easily imagine a situation, right? Let's play that game, that hypothetical history game that I don't like to play. We could imagine a situation, let's say that Roosevelt had lived, he was not dying, and that the economic conditions in the United States after World War II got worse. They didn't get better. You could imagine a situation where the bulk of Roosevelt's own class was coming to overthrow him. And so as a result, Roosevelt would be forced to give even more support and government backing and all of that to the communists, and to strengthen and embolden his alliance with the Soviet Union. And if conditions had been right, you could see Roosevelt becoming like a Hugo Chavez figure. That's not how history went. And it's not because of good guys and bad guys. It's because of the balance of forces. And that's what I really wish people could understand. I meet so many people that are looking for the perfect third-party candidate. Oh, Jill Stein said this. It's about the balance of forces. It's about the balance of forces. The balance of forces pushed Roosevelt in one direction, and then he died, and the balance of forces pushed things in another direction. But it's these divisions in the ruling class that create an opening for the working class. And that's what we need to understand when we're operating. We need to build a movement that can engage in strategic alliances and can push forward what we want. Now, I want to talk about McCarthyism. So after World War II, we had McCarthyism. The USA had the strongest economy of any country in the world at that point, because the rest of the world had been blown up in the Second World War, and so we hadn't been destroyed, and so we were giving the world all their steel and all the cars, and the USA had a booming economy. Because the USA had a booming economy, the message of the Communist Party was not very appealing anymore, right? Fight or starve, we're not starving. We need to have a revolution to overthrow the system. We don't need that. Everything's fine. So the Communist Party stopped being very popular. Plus, there was this new invention called the television, right, which put propaganda in everyone's home. And so the television was there to scare the crap out of everybody that the communists were going to come kill them and, murder them and blow them up with atomic bombs, etc. And so the conditions were ripe for a crackdown, right, on the Communist Party. And the Communist Party was outlawed, and the leaders were thrown in prison, and you had, the McCarthy period. It was a very awful time. It started out with the Democrats. The Democrats had like the Roosevelt wing of the Democratic Party that had been friendly with the communists, and they were crushed. The Democrats, the Catholic trade union associations crushed the Roosevelt wing. And then the Republicans accused the Democrats of being soft on communism. They said, who lost China after the 1949 Chinese Revolution? And so the Republicans started calling the Democrats communists. And then Joe McCarthy emerged in the early 50s as this Republican who was very, very opposed to communism and was seeing communism everywhere. And Joe McCarthy, he was a lot like Donald Trump in that he represented lower level capitalists, because the Democrats had been accusing the Roosevelt wing of being communist. The Republicans had been accusing the Democrats of being communists. But McCarthy was accusing the Rockefellers of being communists. And he was saying that Wall Street bankers were communists. And he was saying that the richest people in the country were communists. And what it really was, the last stage of McCarthyism, was a kind of middle-class uprising against the ruling class. The big monopolistic corporations had come out of World War II so powerful and strong that the small business owners, your doctors, your lawyers, your lower-level capitalists, they felt like they were being crushed by the big monopolies. And so they, in their minds, they saw the big monopolies as being communists. And of course, as Joe McCarthy went in that direction, he was crushed. And they revealed that he was gay, that he'd raped some people, and they outed him as being gay, and and he eventually drank himself to death, right?
Very parallel to how some of our conservatives talk now.
Exactly. It's exactly. And after Joe McCarthy died, they formed the John Birch Society. Do folks know the John Birch Society? It was a far-right organization. Yeah. They were people who admired Joe McCarthy, but also had this belief that the big monopolistic corporations in the United States were all communists, right? So after the downfall of McCarthyism, right, you have what's called the wave of Cold War liberalism, right? McCarthyism is broken. Eisenhower is a Republican president, so he can stand up to McCarthyism because he's a Republican. And Joe McCarthy is censured by Congress. He's eventually dies. And there were problems that Joe McCarthy was carrying out, one of which is that Stalin had died, right? And the new leader of the Soviet Union, Khrushchev, was somebody who wanted to accommodate with the United States. But Joe McCarthy and his crowd would never want to accommodate with a communist leader. Yugoslavia had cut ties with the Soviet Union. It was the first communist government to align with the United States against the Soviet Union. So the USA wanted to send lots of aid to Yugoslavia to help break up communism. But Joe McCarthy and his allies were saying, no, we can't possibly aid any communists, right? So you have the wave of what you call Cold War liberalism. The Communist Party had been crushed and destroyed, and you had the Civil Rights Movement. And the Civil Rights Movement was breaking out. 1954, 53, I believe, was the Montgomery bus boycott. What was going on there? What was happening was that Jim Crow segregation is what the Soviet Union used to lampoon the United States on the global stage. The United States said it stood for freedom and democracy. And all the Soviet Union had to do was show the image of Emmett Till's mutilated body and say, yeah, that's freedom and democracy for you. And on top of that, while the bulk of the population was in an anti-communist frenzy, the black people in America were very well aware of the fact that the Soviet Union was constantly talking about their oppression at the United Nations and had taken a petition, We Charge Genocide. And that's one of the great activities that the Communist Party did during the time when they were completely illegal. I try not to start crying when I talk about this, but I met old communists who talked about how they had relatives in jail, and they took, mimeographed copies of We Charge Genocide door to door in black neighborhoods. Did you know the Soviet Union supports you? And gave copies of We Charge Genocide. And that put a huge amount of pressure on the American government. And so as part of this wave of Cold War liberalism, you saw the United States, sections of the ruling class, the Kennedy family and others, saying we need to address Jim Crow segregation. There was a division in the ruling class over Jim Crow segregation. And the Ford Foundation and a lot of these liberal foundations were paying for the civil rights movement. They had what they called freedom schools and freedom summers, where they would have Dr. Martin Luther King or somebody, and they would have young people, white and black, go to these schools, and they would sing and clap, and they'd learn about civil disobedience. And no communists were allowed. Communists were completely banned. We're not communists here. We hate communists. We just believe in the American Constitution and civil rights. But there was the civil rights movement was a mobilization by the upper level capitalists to try and kick around the Joe McCarthy and lower level capitalists in order to deal with the Jim Crow issue to strengthen U.S. imperialism. They were not communists at all, but they saw that as a way of strengthening imperialism, a division in the ruling class. And it was the ultra rich who were paying for it, and the Communist Party was largely forbidden from it. But it brought all kinds of people into politics. All kinds of people who wouldn't have been thinking about politics were getting recruited. There was an organization called Students for a Democratic Society, SDS. That was the big activist group. And what started out, it was funded by the United Auto Workers Union, the UAW union, and it was done in coordination with the Democratic Party, and they were given millions of dollars. And on every college campus, the liberal activist group people could join was called Students for a Democratic Society. And in order to join it, you had to actually sign a card that said you were not a communist. You were not a communist, and you could join Students for a Democratic Society. But after a while, you get a bunch of young people involved in politics, and you get them reading about things, and pretty soon, SDS was overwhelmingly led by communists. And the civil rights movement eventually became the Black Liberation Movement. The Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee eventually gave birth to a group called the Revolutionary Action Movement, which was like a secret communist party for black people only, that led to the creation of the Black Panther Party. And that even though it had started out as this was the liberal capitalists trying to stabilize things, they had opened the door to the
rise of, in the 1960s, you had the beginning of what they called the new communist movement in the 1970s. You had the Black Panthers, you had the Maoist communist groups that came out of Students for a Democratic Society. You had a layer of about 1 to 2 million people that were getting interested in communist politics because they had protested the Vietnam War and because they had protested, for civil rights, and they saw that the communists were right in the process of that, and communism was still a big force around the world. And you had the new communist movement. Now, a lot of those groups realized that they needed to get to the masses. And a lot of them went and got jobs at factories, and they did what you're supposed to do. But the U.S. economy was still strong. You still had the aristocracy of labor. And in Detroit, they got people elected to city council, and they had support. And in Atlanta, Georgia, and some other places, they had some support. But overwhelmingly, the American white working class didn't want to hear it, right? Now, and then that brings us to, and I have a timeline in the back in some of our books. I talk about the events of 1978 through 1981. This time period is very important. If a lot, if you get into leftist history, there's a lot about 1968 and Vietnam. But this time period, this was a period where there was a very clear division in the U.S. ruling class because they had the first serious economic downturn since the end of the Second World War. And there was a big fight in the ruling class. And Jimmy Carter represented kind of the ultra-rich. And he first went after his own party. He went after the smokestack Democrats, they were called. Democrats that didn't believe in degrowth. Democrats that wanted to build up the infrastructure. And he used what he called abscam. And the FBI sent an FBI agent dressed as an Arab sheik to go and try and bribe these members of Congress. Yeah, American Hustle. It's portrayed in that movie. Yeah. And they purged the Democratic Party of Democrats that actually believed in growth that were tied to organized labor. And then in addition to that, as the U.S. economy was crashing, he implemented policies of creating energy scarcity, right? And driving the gas prices up because there was the OPEC boycott that was happening. And so he, in order to benefit the big oil monopolies, the Rockefellers, they drove the oil prices higher than they'd ever.
Inflation was at 15%, right?
Yeah, the economy was very bad.
Yeah, it was huge.
And if you read what he published a document called the Global 2000 Report, which was a White House document that said the only way to solve the economic crisis is with what? Degrowth. We got to degrow the U.S. economy. Depopulation. Yeah, he was trying to implement degrowth policies. And so,
Wall Street hated it.
Of course they did. And so then what happened is Ronald Reagan emerged, and Ronald Reagan was part of aligned with the military-industrial complex. He was going to restart military spending. Yeah. And there was a fight in the ruling class between Carter and Reagan.
Yeah.
And Ronald Reagan was a hard-right conservative who had ties to the John Birch Society and all that, but he believed in economic growth. And Jimmy Carter was the first Democrat who was a new left Democrat. He wasn't like Kennedy. He wasn't like Lyndon Johnson. He didn't believe in growth. He was a degrowther, right? And so you had this fight in the ruling class that got very ugly. It got very extreme. And you can read about all kinds of things that happened. What's also interesting is that there were a lot of communist groups around at that time. There were a lot of different political movements, and all of them were being heavily infiltrated by the CIA and the FBI and used to fight each other.
George H.W. Bush was head of the CIA and didn't tell people that he would, right? And he became the vice president of Reagan. And also there's William Casey, who was head of the CIA and Reagan's campaign director, was the dirty guy who installed the promised software, which I've researched, the prosecutor management information system, and then used it to bring about total information awareness, which means total disinformation.
Right. So
control the media with dirty politics.
Ronald Reagan is elected president, and Ronald Reagan loves nuclear weapons. He loves nuclear weapons, and nuclear weapons in America are also tied in with nuclear power.
Yes, because that depleted uranium or whatever that you're using is what actually then fuels the missiles.
So,
and the Kirmagi was selling it to Israel, and that's a big secret. So, right? They got the Kieran Silkwood case.
So what does all the leftists and communist groups start doing? Start protesting against nuclear power, against nuclear weapons, and against nuclear power.
Yeah.
And who's paying for it? The big oil companies. because nuclear power would put them out of business. And so that wealthy Eastern establishment is funding a movement against nuclear war. And
I was thinking it'll just be in the ground forever. Right. And so it felt like the land will be caused.
it's a side. Now, the issue is there was a division over nuclear power and nuclear weapons in the nuclear arms race. That was
3 Mile Island. Yeah.
3 Mile Island.
yeah,
A lot of people think was deliberate sabotage.
yeah.
Oh, no.
And that there was a fight, but the people that are opposing nuclear power, what are they saying? They're saying you can't play God, right? By splitting an atom. Well, that's not science. That's not Marxism, right? And they're saying that they're saying things that are largely unscientific.
Yeah.
But it's being promoted by big oil, and it's accompanying a degrowth narrative. Growth is bad. Nuclear power is the expression of growth, right? And the Rockefeller oil people kind of, and what's interesting, so I've done a lot of research on the various communist groups at the time and what they were doing, right? And, I was for many years in the Workers' World Party. Well, the founder of the Workers' World Party, Sam Morrissey, he said, we will never say we're against nuclear power because we're not against nuclear power. Maybe we don't trust capitalist companies the way they operate it. Maybe we don't like how it's tied in with the Pentagon and all that. We're not against nuclear power. You can't say you're against nuclear power and be a Marxist. And the Communist Party of the United States, at first, they said that too. They said, nuclear power, we believe in it. We just don't trust the corporations. But then they gave in. And they all kind of joined this mass movement against nuclear power that was paid for by big oil companies. But what's also interesting is, who was also supporting this movement against nuclear power? The Soviet Union, because they want the arms race to go down, right? Because the nuclear arms buildup is also a threat to them militarily. And so you started having joint days of action against nuclear war and against nuclear weapons in the United States and in the Soviet Union, right? And so in the name...
But that's not in the remember, though, as being necessarily connected to the anti-nuclear power. And
they were sending thousands of American anti-nuclear activists went over to the Soviet Union, and there were days of action that were coordinated. And Bernie Sanders, this is when he went over to the Soviet Union and made friends over there, and that all kinds of these liberal activists are going over to the Soviet Union in the 1980s, and they're befriending the Gorbachev wing of the Soviet Communist Party. And that this is all pointing to the fact that
Neoliberalism or is
about like the Scott Ritter stuff, it actually, negotiable treaties, that was the anti-nuclear weapons, right?
well, that was official. That was after the war was over. But I'm talking about there were mobilizations, big parades and stuff in the Soviet Union opposing nuclear weapons. And they were coordinated with the American anti-nuclear movement and the Democratic Party. And that we see that the left has basically become the foot soldiers of the degrowth wing, the ultra-rich. Whereas the lower-level capitalists, the people that were with the John Birch Society, they still believe in economic growth. There's a really good book that I've quoted a lot that really explains a lot of things. It's called The Yankee and Cowboy War by Carl Oglesby. And he talks about how the 1960s, the Watergate scandal and the assassination of Kennedy was a fight between the lower levels of capital that were aligned with the Pentagon and the ultra-rich that were aligned with the CIA and the intelligence agencies. And basically the conclusion that we've come to is that the Yankee and Cowboy War has flipped. At this point, it used to be that the Pentagon and the Ronald Reagan people were the ones that were the most anti-communist and all of that. And the the upper levels were the ones that wanted to negotiate, that defended unions, etc. But we're coming to the conclusion that the Yankee and Cowboy War has flipped. And the lower levels of capital at this point have more of an interest in socialism and a planned economy, especially because 21st century socialism involves lower level capitalists. And they also have more of an economic interest in trading with the socialist countries. That's why they're so go ahead.
So I've heard in conversation like Trump's assassination. Is that like the one with the capitalists or whatever?
It looks like it. This guy who tried to kill Trump was a Ukrainian. Yeah, and he was, it's the liberals that are pushing the Ukraine insanity like crazy and cultivating a layer of people that are hysterically anti-Russian. And there's a fight in the ruling class. And this all leads to the question of strategic equilibrium, right? As we move towards strategic equilibrium, we can strategically align ourselves with the faction that believes in growth. And that is how we can develop and build an organization. And our 4-point economic plan that we've put forward is a plan that would benefit lower level capitalists. They would benefit from a national bank. They would benefit from rebuilding the infrastructure of the country. They would benefit from public control of our natural resources, and they would benefit from an economic bill of rights. Right now, the lower levels of capital, they think that the answer is to just get the government out. Just get the government out. What they're going to realize as the big monopolies come down on them harder and harder is that they're going to need a government that punches up. And they're going to need a government that punches up. And then that leads me towards what was it that at the end of World War II, the Communist Party said that they believed in. Right? The Communist Party, you go to page 2 of your packet. For some reason, it's missing from mine. I see especially, right, it starts on page 1 in order. Right, if someone wants to read that, this is what they put forward. Okay, Tim, go ahead. Page 1 starts in order for the people. This is what the Communist Party said they were for right after World War II. So go ahead and read, Tim.
In order for the people to put the United States firmly on the path toward peace, democracy, and general well-being, the power of the monopolists to dominate our country must be curbed and finally broken. And the people themselves must take political charge under the leadership of the working class. The struggle for socialism grows inevitably out of the everyday fight of the workers and their allies, especially against the present menaces of economic chaos, fascism, and war. In all good times, the American people, on the basis of their existing conditions, will decide how and in what forms they will introduce socialism. The way our party foresees the possible development of the future is along the following general lines. First, we propose the regular election of a democratic coalition government based on a broad united front combination of workers, small farmers, Negroes, professionals, small business groups, and other democratic elements who are ready to fight against monopoly, economic breakdown, fascism, and war. This type of united front government could well have behind it an overwhelming majority of the people, as it has in other lands. It goes without saying that the election of such a democratic government could only be brought about in the face of powerful and very surely violent opposition from organized reaction.
All right, somebody else read the next part, second. All right. Okay, go ahead. And then, we can do shorts. I'll do a second.
Second, our party contends that such an anti-fascist, anti-war, democratic coalition government, once in power, would be compelled either to move to the left and martyrdom. With state power in its hands, it would be forced to pass over the more or less defensive program along which it was elected to the defensive poles.
So talking about a government punches out, right? Yeah, offensive policy. Right.
Confronted with the sabotage and open resistance of big business, it would have no other alternative than this if it hoped to realize any of the progressive legislation of its program to ensure its staying in power. A people's government would be forced to proceed directly to curb and magnify the power of the monopolies by adopting far-reaching policies and nationalization of the banks, nature industries, the breakup of big landholding, the beginnings of a planned economy, the elimination of reactionary elements from the control of the army, schools, industry, as well as various other measures to weaken monopoly and distracted working class was the leading reported indignation. Go ahead.
Third, a democratic, anti-fascist, anti-war government under the violent attacks of the capitalists and its efforts to find solutions to the right economic and global problems, if it were to survive, would necessarily move leftward towards socialism, much as the people's democracies in Eastern and Central Europe are now doing. American socialism beyond parcel will have its own specific wants and methods. But basically, it will be the same as socialism in other countries, with monopoly capital completely defeated, set industries and natural resources in the hands of the people, production for generations set up for profit, and the working class to leaders of the people.
Okay, you can stop there. But that was what they advocated, the construction of an anti-monopoly coalition to defeat the power of the imperialists. And ultimately, in order to defeat the power of the imperialists, the working class would have to become empowered. and would have to break the power of the imperialists and would have to ultimately set up those planned economies. And that planned economy would benefit the small business owners, and it would benefit the overall population, and it would be at the expense of the ultra-monopolistic corporations. And that's what we're for in CPI. We are for an anti-monopoly government, an anti-war government, an anti-fascist government, a pro-growth, pro-humanity government. And what we seek to do is to stimulate the conversation toward creating that. And that is the vision of this organization. And I mean, we have a list of everything we've done this year, and I'll go over that tonight when I talk. But what I'm thinking that we could do to change the conversation, we've done a lot to change the conversation. We'll talk about that tonight. But that convention that we do next summer, have 400 people gathered from different political perspectives, all kind of talking about this. There's a lot of people that we can nudge the conversation in a good direction. There's a lot of people that have a vague understanding of this. There's small business owners that understand we're being degrown. There's working people saying, what the hell has happened to the country? There's people saying, why are we going to all the wars around the world? We can put forward a program that, first of all, links it all together and explains where it's coming from, and could lead toward the conversation that could lead to the formation of an anti-monopoly government. And what I want to point out is that we don't have one true party syndrome, okay? If there's going to actually be an anti-monopoly coalition, it's going to be a real coalition. There's going to be all kinds of different people in it, from all kinds of different perspectives, who believe in economic growth and want to oppose the power of the big monopolies. And we're going to be one voice as part of a much bigger conversation. And, I think, there's people who've talked in the past about throwing the newspaper over the wall, that sometimes we might have an idea of a proposal, and, we'll go out there and we'll talk about it, and somebody else will pick it up in the establishment. We've seen this happen already. Right? I mean, my book about Kamala Harris. I wrote the book about Kamala Harris that you see, already Tulsi Gabbard was reading it and people were talking about it. And and to be a factory of ideas, to be developing policies, proposals, slogans, and analysis that can be constantly pushing us toward the building of an anti-monopoly coalition. That is why the Center for Political Innovation exists. We want to nudge and change the conversation toward the construction of a real anti-monopoly coalition, with the understanding that the actual anti-monopoly coalition that emerges is going to be way bigger than us. We're just going to be one group that puts on conferences and has rallies, and if for it to really work, it's going to be way bigger than us. But we have the ability to push the conversation forward. I talked about the Velvet Underground before. During the 1960s, everyone knows about the Beatles. Everyone knows about the Rolling Stones. There's another rock band called the Velvet Underground. People don't know about the Velvet Underground.
I don't know.
Well,
Some people here might know about that.
but the Velvet, they did things. They did things that the Beatles and others could then look at and do. They pioneered. They innovated. They did things with rock that then could change the. If you have a big, huge record label, you can't take all these experiments, but they were smaller and they were able to try things out. They worked, maybe they didn't. And then that opened the space for other people to try them out. And that's why we're called the Center for Political Innovation. We're going to try things out. And that's what we have been doing. We've been blazing new trail by being, breaking out of leftism, right? And becoming what we are by talking the way we do about different topics. We're blazing new trail and changing the conversation. And that is what we aim to do. We're not a political party, but we hope that political parties read our stuff and become influenced by it. And it leads them to help build the anti-monopoly coalition, right? And we're not a Leninist vanguard party. We don't have democratic centralism. And that also, I want to mention that I've been to socialist countries. And modern socialist countries are not like the Soviet Union. In the Soviet Union, there was, for lack of better words, a cult of personality around Stalin. There was one state ideology. When I go to Venezuela, I see that there are, within the ruling coalition, the patriotic pole, you have the United Socialist Party, you have the Communist Party, you have the Fatherland for All Party, you have the Tupac Amaru Party, and you have many people with many different ideas that are part of this ruling coalition. And often, because those folks are part of the coalition, they get subsidized by the government to open their own businesses, to have housing cooperatives and things like that. Remember when I was in Venezuela, we went to one housing cooperative and it was run by a Catholic priest who had run an orphanage, right? There was a young woman who was there and said that she believed, her purpose in life was to die for the revolution. They had a painting of the Last Supper on the faces of all the disciples. They had the faces of like famous communist leaders and all of that. And so then we got back on the bus and they took us to another collectivo. And as soon as we got back from the bus, they said, all right, now when we get to this other collectivo, whatever you do, don't mention where we just were. And I said, why? And they said, well, this Catholic priest guy, he hates these guys and they hate him. And there's a rivalry, but they're both part of the coalition. You know what I'm saying? And that the coalition can be intellectually diverse, right? You know, nowadays, the kind of what we might call psychological totalism, the demand that everyone agree on everything, it's just not realistic, right? The free flow of information, people are going to have their own ideas, people are going to disagree, people are going to challenge each other. But the question is, how can we build a broad movement? And on top of that, if CPI is really going to work, and this is really important, what Peter talked about not being a fandom, if we're going to not be a fandom and be a real group, we need as many people in CPI to develop their own project, their own business, their own outreach, their own organization as possible, right? We need you to take your own idea and let us help you develop it so that you can build something of your own that is part of the bigger CPI and innovationist community. That's the only way this organization is really going to grow.